Just quick introduction to our next speaker. Patrick Wardle is the Director of Research at SynAck, and I think he's going to be our only local speaker. So Patrick hails from Maui, can I say that? Maui? And flew over to join us. Actually submitted 2 talks. They both kind of almost got picked, but we didn't want to have him taking 2 slots, so we picked this one. So really looking forward to it, and come on, help me give him a big welcome round of applause. Patrick, take it away.
Hi. How's it, guys? Welcome again to ShakaCon. Definitely really stoked to be here, part of the conference. I mean, it's not often I get to talk and rock slippers at the same time, so kind of cool. So today we're going to be talking about methods of persistence on Apple's latest operating system, which is OS X Mavericks. We'll also be learning about some interesting OS X malware that abuses these persistence mechanisms. And then I'm going to show you how to generically detect them. So my name is Patrick Wardle. After graduating from the University of Hawaii, go Warriors, I began my career at NASA. I was then hired by what I think is probably the only US government agency that actually listens, which is the NSA. I then helped found Vulnerability Research Labs, which was a small computer security company that was recently acquired by CSE. I'm now the director of R&D at SynAck. In short, we do crowdsourced vulnerability discovery with vetted security researchers, and also a lot of cool cybersecurity research. We just closed our Series A funding, and now we're backed by Google Ventures, which is nice because now I can afford to eat something other than just ramen noodles. So today we're going to learn about OS X, malware, and persistence. For the purposes of this talk, persistence means achieving re-execution when a Mac is rebooted. So you can think of a piece of malware that's installed on your computer. Every time the computer is restarted, that malware wants to gain code execution so it can do its stuff. So first in the talk, we'll cover a technical overview of the boot or the startup process. Then I want to talk about methods of persistence on OS X Mavericks. After that, I want to talk about some actual OS X malware, so show you some samples that abuse these various persistence mechanisms. And then finally, I want to introduce an open source tool that can generically reveal persistent malware on the Mac. But before we dive into all of that, I want to first give a little bit of a background. So this is somewhat of an obvious statement, but Macs are pretty much everywhere. Recently, Apple became the #3 the US computer vendor, making up almost 15% of sales. And if you count iDevices, which I think actually helped spur the adoption of Macs, Apple actually outsold Windows in Q4 of last year. People think Macs are great products, and they are. And a lot of people think that one of the best things about Macs is that they don't get malware, computer viruses, which I think is pretty amusing. It actually turns out that the first computer virus, which was called the Elk Cloner, first computer virus that was discovered in the wild, was actually a computer that infected Mac computers. So kind of ironic. Since then, Mac malware has definitely flourished. Last year, there were over 30 new OS X malware families that infected corporate systems of Facebook, Twitter, and even Apple, which is kind of embarrassing for them. More worrisome, at least in my opinion, is recently there have been several successful targeted attacks specifically against OS X users. There were some Tibetan activists that switched to using Macs because they thought they were more secure, and the Chinese, were still able to gain access to them. So this, to me, illustrates that if needed, OS X can be easily penetrated by a skilled attacker. So Apple has recently introduced a myriad of security enhancements, which to me confirms that, hey, OS X malware is really a problem. Apple claims that this is very proactive. They want to make sure their users are secure. But in reality, I think it's more of reactive steps that they're taking. But they just put a positive spin on it. These security enhancements include XProtect, which is Apple's built-in antivirus product, Gatekeeper, which verifies downloaded software, Sandboxing, which prevents applications from accessing OS or core-level components, and finally, signed code, which is a mechanism where all signatures are verified and only signed kernel extensions or kexts are allowed to load. So we're all pretty secure, right? Well, I'm going to show you in the next few slides both the strengths and the weaknesses of these enhancements. So XProtect, as I mentioned, is Apple's attempt at an antivirus product. In the slide, you can see an XML or a signature from its XML signature file. So there's a description field which contains the name of the malware that it's attempting to detect. And then the match array details how the malware will be detected. You can see there's a hash of the binary, the malware, and then the name of the file. So this is actually really lame. Why is it lame? Basically, it means that XProtect can't detect new or even modified malware. I mean, it's looking for an exact hash and exact file name. So if an attacker simply recompiles the malware or changes the file name, XProtect will not be able to detect it. Gatekeeper is another security mechanism that Apple introduced. In my opinion, it's a little misunderstood. I saw an article from last year that said, there's this new Mac malware sample that infected Gatekeeper and it bypassed OS X Gatekeeper. And everyone was like, oh my goodness, is there an O-Day in Gatekeeper? Like, what's wrong with it? Well, it turns out you just have to understand how Gatekeeper works to understand its limitations. So the way Gatekeeper works is for programs that are downloaded from the internet, Gatekeeper will validate the digital signature of the downloaded file and choose whether to let it run based on the user's settings. Gatekeeper, though, only checks unsigned files that have a quarantine attribute set. So when the file is downloaded, the application that is responsible for downloading the application, so maybe iTunes, the App Store, or more commonly a browser, has to set this quarantine bit. This means that Gatekeeper cannot prevent the execution of binaries downloaded via an exploit. So if you browse to a malicious page, it has a malicious JavaScript applet or some other zero-day vulnerability, obviously that shellcode is not going to add the quarantine bit to the files it downloads. So when that file is then executed, Gatekeeper is not even going to be invoked, is not going to check that file, and the binary, even though it's unsigned and untrusted, is going to be able to execute. Another thing is if the binary has a valid developer ID, Gatekeeper won't scan it or complain about it as well. So I'll show you some malware samples that are actually signed with a legitimate developer ID that allowed them to get around Gatekeeper. So apps on iOS are sandboxed, and OS X is starting to follow this suit. A sandbox is important because what it can do is it can limit the damage an application level exploit can do. And actually in its current implementation, the OS X app sandbox is pretty secure. In the past, applications could access anything the user could. Now apps, or if they're exploited, exploit code running within them is definitely strictly limited to what they can access. So all apps that are downloaded from the Mac App Store are sandboxed, as are some of the native Apple apps, such as Mail or FaceTime, which have attack surfaces that might be exposed. So again, borrowing from iOS, OS X now verifies all binary signatures. This is really important because it ensures that binaries have not been subverted, for example, infected with malware or a virus. So binary infection is actually a very, very powerful technique, as it affords an attacker a way to persist, hide, and inherit. So if you think about an attacker infecting Safari, every time that Safari is launched, the viral code will be able to execute. So it's a way to achieve persistence. It's also really stealthy because if all the malicious or viral code is within Safari, there's not going to be any other external processes or files on the disk that the user might notice. And finally, it allows an attacker or malicious code a way to inherit trust. So if you're running a software-based firewall product, something like Little Snitch, it's probably going to let Safari talk to the network. So if there's malicious code running within the process space of Safari, it's going to be able to access the network as well. So what happens if malware tries to infect a signed binary? Well, it turns out the OS loader will detect the subversion and terminate the app, which is a good security posture. If you can't trust the app, just kill it. So you may be wondering, how secure is this mechanism at preventing malicious infections? Well, it turns out that unlike iOS, unsigned apps are allowed to still execute on OS X. Basically what happens is the OS level loader looks for an LC code signature block in the binary. If it finds the signature block, it then re-verifies the binary to make sure there's no modifications. However, I found out that if the signature block is removed, the binary can be modified with no consequences. So there's a number of quick and dirty ways to remove this block. You can change the type of the signature block, just say it's another type. Or you can actually just decrement a counter that says the number of blocks, and since it's the last block in the Mach-O file, the loader won't even examine it. So this is rather a big security issue, because what it means is an attacker can simply unsigned a signed application, for example, Safari, and then infect it with viral code, and it will still be able to execute. So here's a little Python script I wrote. Basically, you see we MD5 Safari. We then run the unsigned script, which unsigns it and injects some malicious code. If we recompute the hash, we show that it's different, so there are modifications. Then if we open Safari, again, which has been modified, normally it should be terminated. But since we've now removed that signature, it's allowed to execute, even though it contains malicious code. Kind of surprised Apple let this happen, but sometimes their security is lacking. So in order to protect the kernel from malicious code or from rootkits, on Mavericks, all kernel extensions have to be signed. This is similar to Windows 64-bit, where digital signatures are verified, and unsigned drivers are not allowed to load. An unsigned or modified kext or kernel extension will fail to load. So here we have user mode and kernel mode. The signed kernel extension is allowed to be loaded into the kernel, while the unsigned one is blocked, and there's an alert that's given to a user. So for research purposes only, I want to show you some ways to bypass this. This should show you that Apple's security, again, is fairly weak. So this is a publicly described technique. And if we look at this source code for the user mode program that loads the kext, it's called kextd, we can see that it is responsible for verifying the signature. So yes, the signature is verified in user mode. This is a huge fail. Why? Well, it means that an attacker who's running code on a box and is trying to load an unsigned kernel driver into kernel mode can modify the user mode daemon that's responsible for loading the kernels and either turn off the user mode checks or simply patch them out. So here we can see I use the debugger to attach to the PID of kextd, which again is the program that loads these kernel mode drivers from user mode. What I then did is I disassembled the checkkext signature function and just patched it so that it always returns 0, which means status success, signature is always valid. With this patch in place, we can then unload an unsigned kext, and it'll be loaded in the kernel. So that technique works great. It's really well publicly known and also requires some low-level hacking, either code injection or in-memory patching. So I wanted to find a simpler way to bypass kernel mode code signing. So this is a method I uncovered earlier this year. It's now pretty well known. And the way it works, it turns out that simply unloading that daemon that loads the kernel mode drivers and then attempting to load the unsigned kernel mode extension directly allows it to work. Basically, without kextd running, no code signing checks are performed. And kextload, the command to load the kernel mode driver, loads it directly. It should also be noted that if there's kernel vulnerabilities, for example, there was a recent one which was a processor set tasks bug, this also allows unsigned drivers to be loaded as well. Of course, if these are patched, that technique goes away. So what's the current situation? So sure, Apple is one of the most valuable companies in the world, but in my opinion, the current situation from a security point of view is pretty bleak. There's a lot of Macs, and they're just growing. There's definitely anti-malware protections, but they're all pretty feeble and able to be circumvented. And there's a lot of OS X malware, which I'll be talking about. And also, there's limited tools to detect this malware. I think a lot of people assume Macs are secure, so there's not a lot of research or tools out there. However, with a decent understanding of the Mac boot process and how it may be abused to persist malware, we can definitely protect ourselves. And a new tool, which I'm going to talk about, which is open source as well, can also help us detect such malware. So I now want to briefly talk about what happens when you power on your Mac. The startup process is definitely complex. I mean, there's books been written about it. But I'm going to try to break it down into more manageable chunks. So the various stages we're going to talk about today include the power on, or the boot process, talking about the kernel and how it's initialized and loaded, launchd, which is the first user mode program, and finally the logon window, which authenticates the user and then displays the desktop. As I mentioned, this is a pretty high-level overview. If you're interested in kind of getting into the lower-level details, there's a great book by Jonathan Levin that I would definitely recommend checking out. So early startup covers everything from power on until the kernel, or OSX, begins executing. So it begins with powering on. Once power is present, the boot ROM takes over. Following this, the boot.efi program is executed, which loads the kernel, ending the early boot process. The boot ROM, or firmware, is the first code to actually execute. What it does is it verifies memory, begins hardware initializations, and then selects the operating system partition. Once the boot ROM is done, the boot.efi program is executed. The boot.efi program has some tasks as well, such as initializing the device tree, locating and loading any kernel boot drivers. It also loads and maps and loads the kernel into memory, and then finally jumps to the kernel to begin execution of OS X. It's kind of interesting to note that at this point in the boot process, Macs can actually execute portable executable files, so EFI files or PE files, which are normally associated with Windows. So that's kind of neat. So once the early boot process is complete, OS X begins to boot. This starts with the kernel, then launch D, then the login window, and finally the entire startup and boot process completes with the user's desktop being shown. So I mentioned the kernel is the first component of OS X. The kernel is actually composed of various subsystems, so each of these have to be initialized in order. So first is the mock subsystem, which is initialized. And then following this, IOKit loads all devices that are, or all kernel extensions that are device-specific. And then finally, the BSD subsystem is initialized. And most notably, the BSD subsystem then executes the first user mode process, which is launch D. So now we're actually finally in user mode. As I mentioned, launch D is the first user mode program, and it's executed directly by the kernel. And what it does is it launches all daemons and agents. I'm going to talk about these a little later, but if you're familiar with Windows services, you can kind of think of these as the same. As the first process, it has a PID of 1 and is also the ancestor of all other processes. So the final step before reaching the user's desktop and completing the boot and startup process is the execution of the login window process. What the login window process does is authenticates the user and then sets up their environment. What it does is it asks for the password, talks to Open Directory to authenticate them, and then loads the desktop. The login window then hangs around to manage the user session. So if you need to force kill a process, or if you want to log in or log out, this is the login window interacting with the user. All right, so now we know what goes on when a Mac is starting. Knowing this, I want to now present a fairly comprehensive list of ways that this startup process can be abused to achieve persistence. Now remember that persistence for malware is essential, as it ensures that whenever the computer is restarted, the malware is automatically re-executed by the operating system. So again, kind of starting at the lowest level, there are several options for persistence. At this point, these persistence options are pretty complex and even maybe sometimes hardware specific. However, they run below or before the operating system, which makes them very difficult to detect. So there are several possible options for persistence at this low level in the boot process. Reflashing the firmware, installing a malicious EFI component, or even infecting the boot.efi file. Now, each of these options could be a talk unto themselves. So if you're interested in this, there's a great talk and paper by SynAck that covers some of these details about these techniques. Since code that runs in the kernel runs at the highest privilege levels in terms of the operating system, it's a really good place for advanced malware to live. And malware that executes here is often referred to as a rootkit. So how does one create and install a persistent kernel extension? It's actually pretty easy, but there are several steps that you have to perform. So first you create a kext in Xcode. Xcode actually has a template. You say, hey, I want to create a kernel extension, and it kind of fills out stuff. So it's pretty easy to do that. Once it's compiled, you copy it into the kext directory. You then have to set it so that it's owned by root. So the OS won't load any kernel extensions that aren't. And then optionally, you can rebuild the kernel cache so that the new kernel extension is picked up. And remember, you're supposed to, at least on Mavericks, this code, in theory, has to be signed. But as I showed you, there's various ways to get around this. So from an attacker's point of view, this code signing requirement really isn't an issue. So here's just the commands. You can see I copy it into the library extensions folder, which is the kext directory. I then set it to be owned by root, and then finally I rebuild the kernel cache. Once you do this, anytime you reboot the computer, this driver or kernel extension will be automatically started without any user input. Now, while code that runs in the kernel is very powerful, it's difficult to get right. If you screw something up, you're going to panic the box. There's also limited API functions that are available. So a lot of times running in user mode is actually preferable. So launch daemons and agents are the Apple-approved way to persist non-application binaries. So think about software updaters, antivirus products, pretty much things that are going to be running non-interactively in the background all the time. So these daemons and agents are actually very commonly abused by OS X malware. Daemons are non-interactive, and they run before login. And they live in either of these two launch daemon directories. Agents, on the other hand, run once the user is logged in, and may be interactive, though generally they're not. And they live in several of the launch agent directories. So how does one create a persistent launch daemon or agent? In other words, a binary that will automatically be loaded whenever the OS boots up. Turns out it's pretty easy. You simply create an XML property list, or plist, that requires, or that contains several required keys. First is the label, which is just the name of the binary persist. Then the path to the binary image of the daemon or agent. And then following this, most importantly, there's this run at load key that if you set to true, this will ensure that the OS will automatically launch the agent or daemon. So if you save this file now to one of the launch agent or daemon directories, you're good to go. Anytime the boxes reboot, the binary that's specified in this plist will be automatically executed, again, without any user interaction. BSD or Unix users are probably familiar with cron jobs. OS X supports cron jobs, just like in BSD. And it's an easy way to execute a command or script at certain intervals. So you can do it at reboot, or daily, or even once a minute. So in this example here, I'm creating a cron job that actually executes each minute. So again, just another persistence technique, very straightforward, but works. Another method is creating a login or logout hook. By creating a login or logout hook, a script or a command can be automatically executed whenever the user logs in or logs out. Apple states that these hooks are deprecated, but they actually still work fine on OS X Mavericks. So to create such a hook, you can use the defaults command. What you do is simply specify a write action, and then the com.apple.login plist file. And then finally, the script or the command to persist. If you then look at the plist file that you just wrote to, you can actually see the hook in memory. So you can just dump that file. It's either binary encoded or in plain text, and you can see the login or the logout hooked. Again, so once this is set, in this case it's a login hook, anytime the user logs in, the user bin hook.sh script will be automatically executed. So for application, login items are the Apple-approved way to persist. Anything that's registered as a login item is visible in the GUI. So you have things like the iTunes helper, VPN software, pretty much any apps that need to be automatically executed will be stored as a login item. Login items are stored in another plist file, and this file contains the name of the item, whether it should be hidden or not, and then base64 encoded data that contains, amongst things, the path to the binary or the application to execute. So with the introduction of the Mac App Store and app sandboxing, apps actually can't register themselves as traditional login items anymore because that's a system-level component. They don't have permissions to access that. So in order to work around this, Apple designed a new way that allows apps in 2 easy steps to register themselves still as a login item, just in a new way. Now, the best or worst part of this is that this doesn't show up in any GUIs. So I mentioned 2 steps are required. You need 2 apps. The first one is the main application and then a helper app. The app to persist, which is the helper app, should be copied into the login items subdirectory of the main app. The main app then, when it's executed, should invoke the SM login items set enabled function. And what this will do will persist the helper app, and it will ensure that every time the user is logged in, that this helper app will be automatically executed as well. So again, this is a technique that malware can use to persist. So those of you that use Macs are probably enjoy the feature where whenever you log out and then log back in, any apps that you had open are automatically reopened. This is the default behavior on OS X Mavericks, unless you uncheck that button when you log out. And apps that are automatically or going to be automatically reloaded are stored in yet another plist document. Now, if you dump this plist, you can see information about all the apps that are going to be automatically reopened. So there's the ID of the app, again, whether to hide it or not, and then, of course, the path to the application. Again, malware may abuse this technique by modifying directly this plist, and then whenever the user is the user is logged in, the application that's specified in there will be automatically executed. Another deprecated technique that still works on Mavericks are startup items. Startup items, again, require several steps. The first is to create a script that contains whatever you want to be, whatever is to be automatically executed. Then you should create a file that's called startup-parameters.plist. This file should contain a provides key, and that contains the name of the script that you created in step 1. Both of these then should be placed in a folder that's in one of the startup item directories. And it's really important that this folder then has the name that matches the script. Now, if you follow these steps exactly, anytime the computer is restarted, the startup item script will be automatically executed. So again, another technique that malware could abuse. Another BSD technique that actually works on OS X and that can allow a script or, again, a command to be automatically executed are RC scripts. The RC common file is parsed and processed anytime a Mac is restarted. So if you put any malicious commands in there, they will be processed by the operating system and executed whenever the computer starts. Another technique, sorry, there's a lot of these, is the launch control program that interfaces with launchd. When a Mac starts up, launch control looks for a file named launchd config. And if it finds that, it parses that and automatically executes any commands that are in there. Now, this file is not normally created, but if you create it and put commands in there, they will be processed. Now, these can't be normal script or shell commands, because they have to be launch control commands. But it turns out the bs exec command, which is a launch control command, can be used, and that in turn can execute any scripts or commands. So the final persistence technique I want to talk about is more of just an old school virus writing technique. Back in the day when I was growing up, virus writers were the cool guys. They were releasing all these cool articles about binary infection, and really viruses were the most common form of malware. So viruses work by infecting files, injecting viral code in order to replicate. Since we showed that OSX apps can be unsigned, binary infection, might be back in style, which I kind of hope because it'd be some nice job security. So there's a lot of different ways to infect an OSX binary. The simplest way was described by one of the old school virus writers named Roy G. Biv. And what it does is it injects some viral code into a target binary and then hijacks the entry point to point to the viral code. This ensures that the virus's code is executed whenever the application is run. So an attacker might infect the user's browser, their chat client, their mail client, something that is commonly executed to ensure that the virus or the malicious code is executed as well. Okay, so actually this is the final persistence talk, or technique I'm going to talk about. So many applications such as browsers support plugin architectures, which are dynamic libraries that are automatically loaded when the application is run. Malware writers can and have abused this functionality to create malicious plugins. So some apps that are commonly targeted include browsers such as Safari, Firefox, Chrome, or even iTunes. Now, it's sometimes hard to get the app to automatically execute this malicious plugin. Sometimes they'll load it, but then it won't export a certain function, or they'll just decide they don't like it, so they'll unload it without executing any code. Well, it turns out you can get around this by exporting a constructor. Basically, what you do is you create a dynamic library, and you specify the constructor attribute in a function. If a file has this, the loader, when it's actually loading the dynamic library, will actually execute the constructor before handing off control to the application. So this is a really good way to ensure that your malicious code is always executed, even if the application which is loading the plugin ends up not liking your plugin. So I wanted to have a rest in peace slide for persistence techniques that no longer work. So they've either been fully deprecated or removed from OS X Mavericks. So these include the environment.plist, the system login items.plist, the auto launch application directory, and finally persisting injectable dynamic libraries via the dyld insert library environment variable. Okay, so we've talked a lot about OS X malware startup persistence techniques. So I wanted to show you some real-world malware samples that actually abuse these techniques. So a year or two ago, somebody, Chinese, who are we kidding, started targeting Tibetan nationals who use Macs with malicious Word documents. The payload of these attacks was Call Me. This malware is pretty basic, but what it does is when it executes, it persists as a launch daemon. So you can actually observe this by using the FS usage tool, which is kind of like FileMon for Windows. It shows file I/O activity. And when the implant or the binary is first run, you can see it creating this plist file to install itself as a launch daemon. Then once the malware is finished installing, if you look at the launch daemon directory where the launch daemons are, you can see the plist it's created. And then its binary, which is also named real player update to match the plist, will be automatically executed whenever the computer is restarted. The malware that accumulated the largest number of OSX infections is Flashback. So Flashback exploited a known but unpatched Java vulnerability. And this meant that if people who had an older version of Java would visit a malicious or compromised website, they could be automatically infected. Flashback persists as a user agent, which is ironically named Java Update. It's interesting to note that if you look at this, you can see the run at load key, which is set to true. Again, this will ensure that any time the computer is restarted, this malware will be automatically executed. Now, according to online analysis, Crisis is a piece of malware used by nation states. It's fairly sophisticated, though Pedro might disagree. But I think it's just a very complete OSX malware sample, which is kind of interesting into itself. And it even has a rootkit or kernel component to hide processes and files. Again, this is fairly rare in OSX malware, so definitely a very interesting sample. So if we look at the pseudo disassembly from variant C, which was, I believe, discovered in January sometime of this year, you can see the malware is building a path to a file within the user's launch agent directories. So in other words, it's attempting to persist as a launch agent. I find it kind of interesting. You have this really sophisticated OSX malware sample, and it's really using a very, in my opinion, lame or mundane persistence technique that's easy to detect. But I guess it works. There's not a lot of techniques to prevent this, so the attackers just went with the simple way. JannyCab is another OSX malware sample. It's interesting that it's written in Python, though it's compiled before distribution. It's also signed with a developer ID, which is nice because it allows it to get around Gatekeeper. Since it's written in Python, it's actually really easy to analyze and figure out its persistence mechanism, which is a cron job that's set to execute every minute. Once the malware is installed, you can use the crontab.l command to view the malicious cron job. Now, another interesting feature of this that's not really related to persistence is that it makes use of a right-to-left trick to make the malware appear as a PDF document. So if you get this in an email, it's going to actually look like it has a file extension of .pdf, and they use a PDF icon. So the real extension, though, is .app. And the way they get this flip is by using a special Unicode character that transposes the characters around the final period. This has also been commonly abused in Windows malware, but it's interesting to see it transition to Mac malware as well. So these poor activists. Recently, another piece of OSX malware was discovered on an activist computer during the Oslo Freedom Forum workshop. This malware invokes the ls shared file insert item URL function that you can see in the disassembly, so that it's added to the login items of the current user, which thus gives it persistence. So if you view the login items, you can see the malware showing up. So again, this is kind of a lame persistent technique. Yes, it works, but I think these malware authors need to up their game a little. So Yantu, again, another piece of OSX malware. And this works by trying to convince users to install itself. It claims to be an HD plugin or media content. So I'm sure we've all been to websites that tell us we need to install some plugin to view content. Now, if this is QuickTime at the Apple website, probably legit. But Yantu abuses this fact to trick users into infecting themselves. And then once it's installed, it creates malicious plugins for Safari, Firefox, and Chrome. So it uses the browser plugins to ensure persistence. So this allows malware to be automatically executed whenever the user launches any of their browsers. And then while the user surfs the web, the plugin transmits information about the loaded pages and then also injects ads to hopefully get the user to click on them. Malicious code can also be written entirely as a script. It doesn't always have to be written in C or Objective-C. So Renepo is an example of this. By reading the install script, which it's a bash script, it contains comments, which is really nice, we can see that it persists as a startup item. Another OS X malware sample is Mac Protector. Now, this is a fake AV product. Very common to see this on Windows platforms. This was one of the first widely successful ones to infect or target OS X users. Basically, when a malicious or compromised website is visited, there's a pop-up, and it pretends that the user's computer is infected, and there's all this malware, and then it provides itself in a link that says, hey, if you download this, I'll clean everything up. Now, of course, if the user downloads that binary and runs it, only then are they really infected. So I wondered, does this technique really work? So I did a little research, and it turned out there was an article that stated that AppleCare received over 50,000 calls about this malware and how to remove it. And at first they denied it because they didn't want to admit that Macs get malware. But ultimately they added protection into their XProtect product so that it would detect it. Now, of course, the attackers just recompiled and changed it, and then Apple had to update again. So it's interesting if you look at their signature definitions, there's a whole bunch of signatures all just to detect this one malware product. So here we can see it persisting as a login item. And then again, if we dump the plist where these login items are stored, we can see the name, and then there's that basics encoded data that if you decode will contain the path to the Mac Protector malicious binary. Now, the final piece of malware we're going to look at today is a classical computer virus that infects OS X binaries. It works by injecting viral code into a binary, then hijacking the entry point. And so what this does is this gives the virus persistence, because anytime now this infected binary is executed, the viral code will be automatically executed as well. Now, it turns out, though, that this specific piece of malware actually does not unsign applications before infecting them. So on OS X Mavericks, any binaries or Mako applications that it infects will crash at load. The loader will detect that there's been a modification and just kill it. So it's probably going to cause major annoyances, and as a result, will be really easy to detect. Maybe after hearing this presentation, they'll figure out that they can unsign it, but I guess we'll see. So while researching all this malware, even though I'm not an activist or, as far as I'm aware of, a person of interest to any government, I was bothered by the fact that I just didn't know what was automatically executing on my computer, or if there were some stealthy malware installed there. I consider myself a security researcher, and I've worked on Macs for a while, but there's all these processes running and places that different malware could live that I didn't know about. So I looked online to see if there was a tool I could find, and I didn't find anything for Mavericks that would just simply show me everything that was automatically executed when my Mac restarts. So I decided to write my own, and then I wanted to open source it and release it today so that we can all hopefully be more secure. So the goal of this tool is really simple. When I say knock knock, it should tell me who's there. In other words, it should show me everything that's set to automatically execute when my Mac is rebooted. Now, in terms of its design, it's open sourced, written in Python, and it's built on an extensible plugin architecture, which I'll talk about on the next slide. It should be noted, though, that knock knock lists everything that's set to automatically execute, which includes legitimate software. So this means that users of it still have to have some knowledge of Mac malware or OS X processes. Although I should point out that signed, verified Apple binaries are ignored. Again, I wanted to keep some job security here. So as I showed you, there's tons of OS X persistence mechanisms that can and are abused by malware. Now, I would be naive to think that I comprehensively listed them all and that new ones wouldn't be found. So it seemed wise to develop Knock Knock based on a plugin-based approach, whereas each plugin could scan for a particular persistence technique. Then as new persistent techniques were found, Knock Knock could be easily extended. I designed Knock Knock so that the core did most of the work, so that writing a plugin is actually really easy. So here's a simplified plugin that enumerates launch daemons, and you can see that it's about 10 lines of code. So first, we simply specify the launch daemon directory, so the system library launch daemons directory, and then the library launch daemons directory. What we do then is just get all the plist files that are in this directory. We then iterate through those and see if the run at load key is set to true. If it is, we know that, hey, this launch agent or this launch daemon is going to be automatically executed whenever my Mac is rebooted. So what we do is we then instantiate a file and pass that back to the to the knock knock core so that it can be displayed to the user. So I do get distracted by shiny things like code signing bypasses or going on Twitter and reading security people ranting about jailbreaks and whatnot. So knock knock is still in beta. Although I mostly just say that, so if anything goes wrong, no one yells at me. However, it's definitely usable, and in fact, and this is a true story, just last Sunday, I had a friend who said, hey, my Mac's running slow, and of course, as I'm sure you guys are all familiar with, since you say you know computers, everyone wants you to fix theirs. So I went over to his house, and I brought Knock Knock with me. I didn't expect to find anything, but I ran it on his Mac, and I found Yontu, which was installed as a Google Chrome plugin, and then I also found Genio, which I'd never seen before in the wild. So this was kind of cool. Proved that the tool, which I developed in the lab with known malware samples, actually worked in the wild. And the best part was this guy was like a surfboard shaper, so he's going to hook me up with a new board. So writing code has some perks. So Knock Knock has some helpful features. It can execute all or just one plugin. It can list all the plugins. And also, as I mentioned, by default, it will filter out Apple-signed binaries that have been verified by Knock Knock. Now, this is important because 95% of persistent binaries on a Mac are going to be Apple binaries that are needed for the system. So if they can be cryptographically verified that they're still signed and have not been modified, it makes sense just to ignore that. Now, this can be overwritten if you really want to see them, but by default, it's hidden. So here is Knock Knock listing cron jobs. And we can see there's a cron job that's set to execute every minute. And in this case, this is JannyCab. We can also list launch daemons and agents, which on this VM reveal the call me implant. As again I mentioned, it does list legitimate binaries as well. So I have Little Snitch installed, which is a software-based firewall. So you can see the Little Snitch daemon and the agent as well. But then in the middle, there's this real player update, which looks shady, if you don't have real player installed. And yeah, like I said, it turns out to be an implant. So we covered a solid amount of material today, so I just wanted to draw some final conclusions. So first, even on the latest version of Mac OS, fully patched, it's really not that secure. Windows has taken security really seriously. I don't think Apple is quite there yet. And also, Mac malware is a reality and a growing concern, especially if the Chinese government doesn't like you. Hopefully, though, armed with this information that's presented in this talk, and by using Knock Knock, we can detect this persistent malware and ensure that our Macs stay secure. All right, well, mahalo for your attention. Are there any questions? Yes, in the front.
If you run as a standard user instead of a user with admin rights,
Yeah.
how much does that help mitigate attack malware?
So overall, I'd say that's a great idea. It will prevent the more common mundane malware samples. There are persistence points that are still available, but they're not going to be as stealthy or as advanced as if you were running as an admin. There are a lot of ODay root prevesks around for OS X. It's really just not that secure as Windows, in my opinion. So if there's a sophisticated attacker, they're gonna get root and infect your box. But for normal users, I would recommend it if it's not too much of a trade-off, because it will definitely mitigate, against 80% of the more common malware samples that are out there. Is there another question?